Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, and thank you so much for joining us today. For the seminar that we are presenting today, the title is Exercise as Medicine in Prevention and Treatment of Cancer. And for those of you who have attended our webinars in the past, you know that one of the goals of these seminars is to present evidence-based education to our community. My name is Mahtab Jafari, and I'm a professor of pharmaceutical sciences and the director of the UCI Center for Healthspan Sciences. One of the goals of the center, again, is to present such webinars, and the topic of today's seminar, I'm sure, attracted many audience members. We are going to have a lot of questions, and we're here really for a treat. And I'm going to let our moderator to introduce Dr. Hicks. But I would like to spend just a couple of minutes and introduce our moderator, Dr. Rick Van Etten. Today's webinar is also co-sponsored by the UCI Health Chow Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. And we are privileged to have Dr. Rick Van Etten, the director of the center, to serve as the moderator today. So just a very brief introduction about Dr. Van Etten. He received his he received his MD and PhD from Stanford. He has served on the faculty at Harvard University and Tufts. He has been at UCI since 2013, and as I mentioned, he's currently the director of the Chow Family Comprehensive Cancer Center, and he's also the Associate Vice Chancellor for Cancer. Dr. Van Etten is a hematologist and a bone marrow transplant specialist with basic and translational research and clinical research activities at UCI. So, Dr. Van Etten.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jafari, and welcome to everybody to this webinar, which promises to be a very exciting presentation. And again, on the role of exercise really as a medical intervention in both the prevention and treatment of cancer. So from the point of view of my role as the director of the Cancer Center at UCI, this I think is a very extraordinarily important area for us. There's, as you will hear from our speaker, Dr. Hicks, there's abundant evidence of many clinical studies that have explored the role of physical activity and exercise in helping to reduce the risk of developing cancer. One of the more unexplored areas is whether or not there's a role for exercise in patients that have actually acquired cancer. And increasingly, it seems that that is indeed the case. For example, there was a recent study from a National Cooperative Cancer Network group that took patients that had colorectal cancer, stage 3 colorectal cancer, who are getting what's called adjuvant chemotherapy to prevent recurrence. And they looked at them over about 1,000 patients and split them up as to whether or not they adhered to the recommended guidelines for nutrition and physical activities that were published by the American Cancer Society. And it was a strikingly positive study, so that the patients that adhered closely to these guidelines had much better outcomes, and they actually had improved overall survival. So I think that provides an important impetus to future studies to see if we can actually intervene prospectively with exercise in patients like that. So without further ado, I want to just introduce our speaker, Dr. Jim Hicks. Dr. Hicks got his PhD in physiology from the University of New Mexico. He did postdoctoral fellowships at the Max Planck Institute in Germany and also at UC San Diego. He was formerly a faculty member in the Department of Physiology at Creighton University School of Medicine in Nebraska. But he was fortunate enough, we were fortunate enough to have him join UCI back in 1992, where he was a faculty member in the School of Biological Sciences in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And there he's held multiple roles in the department, school, and indeed across the entire UCI campus. And these have included Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, the Interim Vice Chancellor for Research and Department Chair, and the Chair of our Institutional Animal Use and Care Committee. Dr. Hicks has published numerous papers and books on the topic of his research, which is in general the physiology of the vertebrate cardiopulmonary system. And his studies have ranged from amphibians all the way up to Homo sapiens, to humans. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hicks, who's going to tell us about exercise as medicine. Jim.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Let me get my screen up here. Just a second here.
Sorry, I was on mute.
If I could say one additional thing just about the question, sorry, Mahtab, if that's what you're going to say. Please hold all your questions till the end, and we have a Q&A function on the Zoom, and please enter your questions there, and we'll do our best to address them after the presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, Rick, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come and present today. So, as Rick said, we're going to talk today about exercise as medicine, prevention, and treatment of cancer. And I want to give you a little bit of overview of how the talk is going to go forward. I want to give a little bit of very brief history of the concept of this exercise as medicine. Talk about then the discovery of the exercise factor, which is relatively recent in the last 20 years, which are called myokines, and the revolution that has had in exercise science in the 21st century. We'll explore a little bit about the role of physical activity in decreasing cancer risk. And then I want to provide two case studies, one on breast cancer and one on prostate cancer, and then finish up here with future directions and where I see this going. So very brief history of the concept of exercise medicine as medicine. If we think about the spread of medicine, it actually comes out of Egypt in the ancient world and spreads, of course, to West Asia through Greece and to Rome. And very often when the topic of exercise as medicine is brought up, the individual that is often credited with the idea is Hippocrates, in the famous Roman physician from Greece. And he actually wrote, walking is man's best medicine. But in actuality, the concept of exercise as medicine may actually come out of India and China over 1,000 years ago, and made its way probably through the Silk Road to find its way in Southern Europe, Greece, and on its way to Rome. And so the idea that physical activity could improve health is very old, several millennia old. During the Enlightenment period, this idea was prevalent. One of its proponents was Bernardino Ramazzini, who's often called the father of occupational medicine. And he wrote that tailors be advised to take physical exercise at any rate on holidays to counteract the harm done by many days of sedentary life. So making this connection between sedentary behavior and physical activity and health. We skip forward to Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s, and who was suffering from gout. In 1770, he wrote, "Leave me, and I promise to be faithfully nevermore to play at chess, but to take exercise daily and live temperately." Again, this idea in the 18th century, continuing to the 18th century, was fairly rooted in common thought that physical activity was important for overall health. As the Industrial Revolution took place, investigators began actually measuring the benefits of physical activity associated and using numerical quantification of that to be a little bit more rigorous about how it played a role in health. And so in the 1840s, there were studies looking at mortality rates among sedentary workers, which were higher than those that were physically active. And Smith in 1860 published a study where London tailors, who were most sedentary, were less healthy than tradesmen. By the middle of the 19th century, the American Association for the Advancement of Physical Education had been launched, and their book called The Laws of Health really became the central part of a new physical education movement in North America. And this movement at that time was dominated primarily, its members were dominated primarily by physicians who specialized in health and exercise and prevention of disease. Well, at the start of the 20th century, the very first paper that looked directly at the relationship of muscular activity to carcinoma was published by Silverstein and Dahlstrom in the Journal of Cancer Research. And what they wrote was, if muscular exercise activity has an intimate relationship to carcinoma, the value of it will be most apparent as a prophylaxis. And this is an area which promised to be the most important in terms of the attack of this malady. That statement in 1922 foreshadows the explosion of research that doesn't take place for another 70 years on the role of exercise in cancer prevention. They also wrote that human carcinoma may be the reaction to and the result of chronic irritation of adult epithelial tissue bathed in body fluids altered by certain metabolic products as a result of deficient muscular activity. Again, foreshadowing this idea that chronic sedentary behavior is detrimental to one's health and it can actually be quantified. Just to show you very quickly a graph from their study, they grouped a variety of individuals from those individuals who were very most active to those that were least active or sedentary. And that's shown here in this slide, group 1 through 6, 6 being the least active. And they plotted this then, the death rates from cancer per 100,000. They focused on males per 100,000 males. And they showed from 1 to 6, 1 being the most active to 6 being the least active, that there seemed to be this relationship between physical activity level and death rates due to cancer in 1922. Simultaneously, 10,000 miles away in Australia, a paper is published in the Medical Journal of Australia called A Theory of Cancer. And there's much of the paper's long and detailed, but what they did talk about is it seemed that there in the urbanization and civil as the world was going through this urbanization process, that less muscular work was being done by all classes of the community. And they wrote that the occupational analysis of cancer rates they find the most laborious trades had lowest rates than those that were more sedentary. So again, consistent with what was being proposed by Silverstein and Dahlstrom here in the US. So it had been, there's a long history then of knowing that physical activity, regular physical activity, is associated with health and may be actually important in altering or decreasing the risk of disease. But for much of the 20th century, the focus wasn't on this idea of exercise as medicine. It really was trying to understand how the human body responds to exercise. And I call then that the 20th century really was the age of discovering the physiological responses to exercise. That is the integration of the lungs and the heart and the skeletal muscles and how they all work together to ensure adequate delivery of oxygen and fuels during exercise. At the same time, there began this interest in understanding what was the exercise factor. What was it about physical activity that resulted in improving one's health? And how might it influence reducing the risk of diseases? Well, the 20th century did show us that the skeletal muscles are the engine of locomotion. And it wasn't then until 2003, in a very famous paper now, called Searching for the Exercise Factor, is IL-6, IL being interleukin-6, a candidate. Two of the authors of this paper, Bente Klarlund, her name was Bente Klarlund Peterson at the time, but Bente Klarlund and Bent Saltine are both physiologists at Copenhagen University. And what they wrote was, we propose that IL-6 and other cytokines are small molecules or proteins that are released from cells, but these are produced by skeletal muscle during activity, that these small cytokines that are produced during activity exerted their effects on other organs of the body, and they should be called renamed myokines, and thus the discovery and the coining of the term myokines. We can fast forward to today. What are myokines? These are a variety of small compounds that are released from the skeletal muscle. This slide shows a skeletal muscle in the center, and all of these abbreviations are different myokines that are released and enter into the blood and can have effects on adipose tissue, on the glucose metabolism, on liver function, on renal function, on the immune system, on blood vessels, on the GI tract, on our bones, and the like. So that we see that the myokines are very pervasive and have widespread effects on the body. And we suddenly began to, or not suddenly, but we realized in 2000, in the early 2000s, that not only was skeletal muscle the engine of locomotion, but it's also a powerful endocrine organ, affecting, with these myokines affecting all aspects of physiological function, as summarized in this slide here. This leads us then to the exploring of the role of physical activity in cancer and the reductions in cancer risk. Because now we have molecules that we know are being released from the skeletal muscle as a function of activity. And these, since they influence all aspects of the body, including the immune system quite pronouncedly, could there be a role then for physical activity in terms of the reduction of cancer risk and possibly in its treatment? Well, I just put up on this slide here, it's two graphs from the Web of Science in which I typed in search terms. On the left, I have exercise plus cancer plus risk, and I published on the number of publications as a function of years from 1986 to 2022. Before 1986, there was very little information whatsoever. And on the right side, I do the same thing for using exercise plus cancer plus outcomes. And you can see this tremendous increase as you go from 86 to 2022 in the number of papers that are being published just that satisfy those search terms. And I've put on these graphs a little arrow that indicates the discovery of myokines or the coining of the term myokines. And I don't think it's just by coincidence that it was that discovery or those discoveries that gave rise to this idea of myokines that resulted now in the motivation for looking at the role of physical activity in disease processes. In fact, today there is a new text, not a new textbook, but a new book called Exercise Oncology, which is the editor is Catherine Schmidt, who's at Penn State University. And she's also the current president of the American College of Sports Medicine. Now, when we talk about studies that look at the role of physical activity in cancer risk and cancer prevention, as well as treating cancer, we can plot or use this physical activity spectrum from very low levels of activity, sedentary behavior, sitting, as we're all doing right at this moment, to low, which is slow walking, to more moderate activity, which is considered brisk walking, to higher levels of activity. And very often, or how we can judge what levels of activity we're at, can be done in the following, because many of these studies that I'm going to talk about are going to focus on moderate to high levels of activity, and they're going to control it to sedentary behavior. We can get our level of activity by actually just taking the simple equation, 220, that number, minus our age, times the level of activity that we want to work at. And then we can use our heart rate as an index of whether we're at moderate activity levels or high activity levels. Well, what is moderate activity or moderate intensity of activity? How's it defined? It's defined at having a heart rate that's between 64 and 76% of your maximum. So how do you get that? 220 minus your age times 64%, and that'll give you your target heart rate that you want to be at. And for high intensity activities, you can do the same. High intensity activity is anything between 70% and 95% of your maximum heart rate. So 220 minus your age times 70 or 80 or 90, and that'll give you your heart rate ranges that you're going to be at. All right. So the first thing I want to do is just show you a very summary of a large meta-analysis, which came out in 2016 in JAMA, Internal Medicine, which looked at the association of leisure time physical activity with risk of some 26 types of cancers. And the total number of people that were involved in the study were 1.44 million adults. And what you see here then, this hazard ratio and the various cancers, the 26 cancers listed here on the left side. And if they are below this middle dashed line, that means that's reducing the risk for cancer. And if it's going above this is increasing the risk for cancer. And what they were comparing were people that were in the 90th percentile of daily or leisure activity. That means doing them sort of most minutes per week. We'll get into the number of minutes here little bit later, and those that had much lower levels of activity. And they did it they divided the groups into those that had a body mass index of 25 or less, which people would consider normal weight, and people that were greater than 25% body mass index, which is considered overweight. And what they found from this was that that it was associated, high levels of physical activity were associated with lowering the risk of 13 of 26 types of cancer, with a risk reduction on average of about 20% or more for 7 of the cancers. What's really important in this study is not only is there this association of leisure time physical activity with reductions in cancer risk, but that if you look at this graph or this plot here, and the plot next to it, it indicated that this was effective at both levels of body mass index, both people that were considered normal weight and those people that are considered overweight, which means that physical activity has a very potent effect, because being overweight is often itself considered a risk factor. So it was somehow negating the risk factors by improving the cancer risk in those that were considered overweight. The conclusion of the study was, and I'm quoting the authors, that healthcare professionals counseling inactive adults should emphasize that most of these associations, that is the improvement or the reduction of cancer risk, at least in 13 major cancers, is evident regardless of body size and even regardless of their smoking history. And it supports the very broad generalization of the findings of that study. How is it that physical activity then reduces these cancer risks? Well, many of these myokines that are shown here in the upper right-hand portion of the graph are having, as I said, have positive effects on immune function. They increase the antioxidant capacity. They have anti-inflammatory effects. They reduce. They have a positive effects on sex hormone binding globulin, which is going to be important in one of the mechanistic links to breast cancer. They also include other kinds of hormones that reduce sort of the inflammatory environment. They actually alter the microbiota composition, which I don't have time to get into, but that's a new area. They reduce inflammation. Again, they reduce oxidative stress. They reduce visceral adiposity. They increase insulin sensitivity or reduce insulin resistance and the like. So these myokines have been shown to have these effects. So here we have now a link between skeletal muscle activity, the release of myokines, and these myokines then having effects on various aspects of the body, which end up having a favorable environment to reduce the development of cancers. So let's take the remaining time to look at the role of physical activity after diagnosis, during treatment, and on survival outcomes. And we're going to use 2 case studies. One will be on breast cancer, and as I said, the other will be on prostate cancer. I picked these 2 cancers because, first of all, that's where most of the research, most recent research has been done. And of course, they are very common cancers. If we look for on the right side of this, where we just look for females and breast cancer is the leading in terms of new cases, and is second in terms of death for cancers among women. I want to give you just a very brief timeline on the effects of aerobic exercise in breast cancer. If you go back to 1983, patients with cancer in 1983 were often considered too sick to be able to exercise safely. And along came Marilyn Winningham. Marilyn Winningham was a graduate student at the time at Ohio State University, and her dissertation in 1983 was called "The Effects of Bicycle Ergometry on Functional Capacity and Feelings of Control in Women with Breast Cancer." To make a long story short, Marilyn Winningham ended up publishing 4 major papers between 1986 and 1981, all looking at the effects of exercise in women that were already diagnosed with cancer, and showing that in fact exercise was well tolerated and had positive outcomes on their overall behavior, the way they viewed what was going on in their lives, and again had effects on the it could be used as an adjuvant to chemotherapy from some of her early work. That was very early on. What follows from that period is an explosion in the studies on exercise and breast cancer. So this is what I've done now is I've done the Web of Science again, search terms exercise plus breast plus cancer in the title, and pulled up 1,397 papers over the last, from 1989 to 2021. And again, I put in the myokines here with an arrow showing that here is in 2003 where we get this definition of myokines. And the explosion of that work, the connection of that work, I think plays a direct role in this explosion now in looking at the role of exercise in cancer. Because now there are compounds that we know that are being released and they can have effects. And therefore, is there this association between exercise? Now, obviously, I can't go through 1,397 papers in just 30 minutes. So let me give you the general consensus of that, and I'll show you a little bit more specifics here. The general consensus: regular aerobic activity significantly reduces the risk of breast cancer, approximately 20%, even higher in women who are postmenopausal, 30 to 40% in some studies. Breast cancer survivors have a 40% lower risk of death from breast cancer if they are regularly active after diagnosis. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on that in the studies that have given rise to that idea. Not only does it have those effects, but regular exercise does reduce symptoms of fatigue. And this is from a meta-analysis that looked at the effects of exercise on symptoms of fatigue from clinical trials in patients undergoing breast cancer treatment. And so here again on this particular plot, you have anything above the dashed line in this particular case favors exercise, and anything below would say that exercise had no real effect or was actually having a negative effect. And these are studies that use different fatigue scales, and I'm not an expert in all these fatigue scales, so can't just comment on the nuances of them. But the overall conclusion was that there was a significant effect of exercise reducing symptoms of fatigue in women undergoing breast cancer treatment. Not only that, but exercise, this should say led there, sorry for the misspelling, to improvement in physical functioning and overall peak oxygen consumption. So they're actually able to increase their oxygen transport capacity, their physical fitness, their cardiorespiratory fitness while exercising during this period. Regular aerobic activity before and after diagnosis reduces the risk of breast cancer mortality. So this is looking at a variety of studies that have looked at the level of physical activity in women before they were diagnosed with breast cancer, and then a series of studies that looked at women after they've been diagnosed. And again, if it's a arrow going below this line, this is a reduced risk. And if you go above, it's an elevated risk. And what they find then is that the meta-analysis shows that engaging in approximate equivalent of about 150 minutes of at least moderate physical activity per week. What does that mean? That means getting your heart rate up to about 60% of your maximum and doing that spread out over the week, not just one time, 3 or 4 times a week, doing that for about 30 to 45 minutes. After cancer diagnosis was associated with about a 24% reduced risk of total mortality among breast cancer survivors. That was in 2016. Here's a newest study. This is just in 2021 from the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. The title of that paper is called Physical Activity Before, During, and After Chemotherapy for High-Risk Breast Cancer, Relationships with Survival. The goal of the study, the researchers sought to examine whether meeting the physical activity guidelines for Americans, the acronym being PEGAs, before diagnosis, during treatment, and after treatment was associated with disease recurrence and or mortality. 1,340 patients were enrolled. They were part of a prospective study of lifestyle and prognosis, which was ancillary to this SWOG clinical trial. And they looked at activity before diagnosis, during treatment, and 1 to 2 year intervals after enrollment. Now, what is this PAGA, by the way, this physical activity guidelines for Americans? This is that adults should strive for 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity or 75 to 150 minutes per week of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity. Walking, running, cycling, swimming, rowing, those are aerobic. And again, moderate activity, 60 to 70%, vigorous activity, 70 to 90% of your maximum heart rate. And you already saw the equation for how to calculate that. What is the outcome from this study that was published? There are 4 key observations. First, high-risk breast cancer patients meeting the minimum PAGAs, that is this minimal guideline, both before and after diagnosis, experienced greater than 50% reduced risk of recurrence of breast cancer and mortality compared with those not meeting those aerobic guidelines. Patients not meeting the minimum aerobic guidelines prior to diagnosis, but who reported meeting those guidelines after treatment up to 2 years of follow-up experienced reduced risk of recurrence and mortality in comparison to patients not meeting the PAGA guidelines. What does that mean? Basically, it's never too late to start. So you've been not very active, you now have been diagnosed with breast cancer, you undergo treatment, but now you're going to get interested in and start exercising. This study says you're going to benefit from that. It's never too late. Patients who consistently engage in lower volumes of regular weekly activity actually had similar survival advantages as patients who met or exceeded the PAGA guidelines. And so regular activity is beneficial regardless of the level. That's an important take-home message. Just be active, any level is better than none. And then this last major point is that pre-diagnosis reports of physical activity and outcomes among those meeting this sort of recommended range of activities, it suggests that even though exercise may not prevent breast cancer in all women, it is consistently, and that's the key word, consistently associated with a survival advantage. Being regularly active prior to diagnosis throughout your life, if you are then diagnosed with with breast cancer, you are going to have an associated survival advantage because of that. And then the last thing I want to do is just talk here briefly about investigating the role of physical activity, again, during diagnosis, treatment, survival outcomes, and then talk about prostate cancer. And again, why prostate cancer? Well, it's the leading, it leads in terms of new cases, 268,000 new cases, and is the second leading cause of death from cancer in men. So let's talk a little bit about the research timeline on the effects of aerobic exercise and prostate cancer. Back in the 1980s, there were a variety of epidemiological studies that examined physical activity and prostate cancer prevalence. And those actually were motivated by some early work that was done in animal studies. So these epidemiological studies were done in humans. In the 1980s, there were 17 studies published in that decade that assessed these effects. And what they find? Well, 9 suggested that exercise would be beneficial in decreasing prostate cancer risk. 5 were inconclusive. And 3, well, they actually showed an increased risk of prostate cancer with increased physical activity. So not a definite answer. But just as we see with breast cancer, such studies then ended up motivating more research in this area. And again, I've plotted this graph from the Web of Science, looking at the total number of publications over years. And I've put in myokines again to show us that once myokines are defined, again, I'm thinking this is driving part of this. And there's about 419 papers now published with these search terms in it. What's the take-home message from these kinds of studies? Well, in general, the consensus is that the effect of an active lifestyle remains tantalizingly unclear in regards to risk of prostate cancer. I wish I could tell you that, yes, there's very strong evidence that being active throughout your, having an active lifestyle reduces your risk for prostate cancer, but that doesn't seem to be the case. However, men who exercise the equivalent of only 1 to 3 hours of, and I should say brisk walking each week, have an 86% lower risk of aggressive prostate cancer once diagnosed. And also, 3 or more hours of vigorous activity exercise per week lowers the risk of prostate cancer death by 61%. So it appears that exercise is really important after diagnosis. in terms of improving your outcomes. And then finally, aerobic exercise has been shown, and I'm going to really stress this at the end, has been shown to be very powerful in terms of mitigating the effects of androgen deprivation therapy in men that have recurrent prostate cancer. So let's look at just some of the data here. This is a huge meta-analysis that looked at the effects of physical activity and prostate cancer risk, showing all the studies that have been done focusing on recreational activities. This is what you do during your leisure time, looking at occupational physical activity. Do you have an occupation where you're physically active? And then looking at people that are involved in regular walking or cycling kinds of activities and looking at their risk. What's the upshot of all of this from this study? Well, the upshot was what I said earlier. The effect of an active lifestyle remains unclear in regards to risk of prostate cancer. It doesn't appear to be a definite answer. It doesn't seem to say that it definitely reduces your risk. It doesn't increase your risk. It just remains unclear. And that just shows, again, anything below that line is reducing your risk. Anything above is increasing your risk. But what we do know is, as I said earlier, that physical activity may have very strong effects on survival. And so this is just one study looking at the proportion of patients surviving and divided into two groups, those with very low levels of activity in the brown line, and those that had at least 150 minutes per week. Again, that'd be something like exercising for 30 minutes 5 times a week at moderate levels of activity. And what you find is that reduces, and this is years of since diagnosis, so a very long time frame, up to 16 years. And those that were physically active after diagnosis had a greater survival outcome than those that were sedentary in terms of all-cause mortality, and even in terms of prostate cancer-specific death. Those that were physically active in the dashed blue line had a much higher rate of survival from prostate cancer-specific death compared to those that were sedentary. One of the big things, though, that exercise has been shown to do is in terms of mitigating the effects of androgen deprivation therapy. Individuals who have had prostate cancer, some are cured of that, and others have recurrent prostate cancer. And when they have recurrent prostate cancer, typically, as the prostate cancer grows and PSA levels start to recur and increase, the standard approach is to put men on androgen deprivation therapy. There have been numerous randomized clinical trials that show that going on androgen deprivation therapy improves overall survival, and particularly when it's used with radiation for intermediate and high-risk localized disease, as well as locally advanced disease. So it is sort of the go-to therapy, continues to be the go-to therapy for men with recurrent prostate cancer. However, androgen deprivation therapy, although it does improve survival, it does result or can result in significant morbidity and a decrement in the quality of life. Because what is androgen deprivation therapy? I mean, some men refer to it as hormonal therapy, or their doctors have told them it's hormonal therapy, but really it's chemical castration. And you're driving testosterone levels down to nearly, they don't go to zero, but go to very low levels. And so some of the issues that are associated with long-term use of androgen deprivation therapy are shown in this figure here. Increased cardiovascular morbidity, increased risk for metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, changes in fat, body mass fat, body habitus change, that is changes in your body morphology associated with fat deposition, fatigue, loss of libido, erectile dysfunction, hot flashes, arterial stiffness, and osteoporosis. All of these are associated with chronic ADT use that is used when prostate cancer has recurred. And because there's no current cure for prostate cancer, ADT is used to slow its progression. Well, there have been numerous trials that have looked at the effects of aerobic exercise and resistance training to try to mitigate the side effects of ADT. And I've listed in this table here all the trials that have been done and what the interventions were. And they were all included aerobic exercise with resistance training, weightlifting for various lengths of time. Again, don't have time to go through all of these in detail, but let me give you aerobic exercise and resistance training can significantly improve the upper and lower muscle strength, increase exercise tolerance, help prostate cancer patients receiving ADT control their visceral fat mass, reduce risk of type 2 diabetes, control BMI, maintain sexual function, and improve ADT-related fatigue. It mitigates the side effects, without a doubt. And this is just a quick graph showing musculoskeletal fitness versus age. And this is what happens if you're on ADT. And of course, the solid dark line is what just happens with age, but with resistance training, you can mitigate this effect in everyone, just from age-related or if you're on ADT. And this is just, again, showing the actual data, showing the case both in upper and lower muscle strength being improved with training in individuals that are on ADT, everything being up here favoring the exercise group. So just to finish up here, what do I think the future directions are? We need to understand more about the molecular mechanisms of myokines. This will allow the prescription of optimal dose, intensity, and mode of exercise training. Resistance training should be explored to prevent cancer cachexia, that is widespread loss of muscle mass in all sorts of cancers. There needs to be more social and behavioral research to understand how to motivate, incentivize people to be more engaged in regular physical activity. This is something that urban planners need to be involved in, how to develop new cities and new towns that promote and encourage physical activity for everyone. It just doesn't mean having to go to a gym. And last but not least, awareness of the beneficial effects of exercise training in cancer patients should be part of formal medical training. It should be promoted globally and integrated with healthcare systems. And I'll finish with this last slide. Here's what we have now. Here's what I envision, though, exercise should be as an integrated part of cancer treatment. And so what we should have is a slide that looks more like this. Is when you see your medical oncologist, you're also going to see an exercise oncologist technologist and nutritionist who, alongside with the oncologist dealing with the standard cancer treatments and therapies, your exercise oncologist, technologist, and nutritionist will help you adjust your diet, get you involved in regular exercise and resistance programs, and improve the overall quality of life. And with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I will take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hicks. Tremendous, very thought-provoking presentation. I want to, before we get to questions, I'm going to take the opportunity to pitch something, which is something that the Cancer Center has interest in that intersects with exercise. And so if I can just share my screen. We actually have an event in the Cancer Center called the Anti-Cancer Challenge. I know, Dr. Hicks, you're familiar with it. It's an annual event to raise money for cancer research at UCI. And we're about to enter our 6th year, and we've raised over $2.6 million in the previous 5 years, almost 10,000 participants. We partner with CHOC, and we return all the money that's raised by participants to cancer research. So the impact of this in the past couple of years has been tremendous. We've received almost $22 million in extramural grants from pilot projects that have been funded by the Anti-Cancer Challenge. Numerous investigator-initiated institutional clinical trials have been launched, and actually 2 startup tech companies have come out of science that was supported by the Anti-Cancer Challenge. So it's an event. There's a 5 and 10K run walk, and also cycling. We have several different distances. And in the run up to the event, we have a lot of educational webinars that touch on topics of health and cancer. So we encourage everybody to sign up and participate. You can go to our website, anticancerchallenge.org, or just take a screenshot of this QR code. You can participate individually. You can join a team. I have a team myself as Cancer Center Director. And we look forward to seeing everyone on Anti-Cancer Challenge Day. That's Saturday, October 8th. It's going to be at Aldrich Park in the middle of UCI's campus. Okay, so let me now get to the questions, because we have a couple. Dr. Hicks, some of the questions have centered on the issue of you've shown studies that show a correlation with exercise and outcomes, cancer prevention, cancer treatment. one series of questions is around, is it possible to determine how much of the effect may be exercise? Because some of these folks who exercise may also, for instance, eat a healthier diet, drink less alcohol, don't smoke. What can you say about the specific impact of exercise and how we might determine that?
Yeah, I mean, so of the number of studies that have been done, there are some that try to control for that. And so that's always going to be an issue, the interactive effects of other kinds of healthy lifestyle choices. And so, what we still need to do is have additional studies that are set up from the beginning to control exactly diet. You're not going to have people smoke on purpose, obviously, but to control diet, which is a big one. As you saw at the very end there, I had healthy nutrition. Nutrition plays a big role in this, something I have not addressed. And so you would want to control then, know exactly what individuals are eating and what other sort of aspects of their lifestyle. The ones that have been published, though, do try to control for that. The one on cancer risk prevention did control for smoking, took that into account, and did look at body mass index as a function of just whether someone was normal weight or being overweight, to try to control if there are other factors involved that were resulting in these changes in risk. So it does vary on the study, but you definitely need more studies that do that in a consistent manner.
Great, thank you. We have another question from one of our viewers, Caroline. She's asking, she wants to know, are the protective effects of exercise that you described, is that really attributed only to aerobic exercise, or can you get benefits from weight training as well? And is that through myokines? Do myokines get released under both sets of types of exercise?
Yeah,